Did you buy this at a flea market? Our first-class cabin isn't a place for people sneaking in on fake tickets. Take your child and get out before I call security. I have a valid ticket? Valid? Look at yourself. Then look around. Do you really think you deserve to sit here?
Get rid of her already. I didn't pay for first class to sit next to something like that.
Out. Do you remember what I told you?
Right now, Mom?
Right now.
The lead flight attendant stared at the black card in the 6-year-old's hand. Her face was drained of color. Jada Monroe's eyes turned cold. Hartsfield-Jackson Airport at 5:52 in the morning was already lit up like the day wasn't allowed to arrive slowly. Electronic boards kept changing gates, suitcase wheels rolled across the stone floors, boarding calls overlapped through the speakers, and the smell of hot coffee covered everything. Jada Monroe sat with her daughter at a fast food counter near gate B18 with 2 egg sandwiches and 2 cups of orange juice in front of them. Jada could have taken Ruby into a private lounge or ordered breakfast from the upscale restaurant at the end of the concourse, but she still chose the plastic table by the glass wall, the one with a slightly uneven leg and a scratched metal napkin holder. That habit stayed with her from the years when she and Ruby had to split one meal, when every dollar could become gas money or one more day before asking for an extension on a bill. Ruby sat across from her, her feet not reaching the floor, a brown cloth doll tucked tightly under her elbow. The doll had black yarn hair, a yellow dress faded from too many washes, and a tiny zipper hidden along its back that no one would see unless they already knew it was there. Ruby ate while using one finger to wipe crumbs off the doll's face, taking care of it like a third passenger. Ruby asked why Mommy wasn't wearing her prettiest white suit. Jada looked down at her light blue shirt, khaki pants, and old sneakers, then said she wanted to see how people treated her when they didn't know who she was. Ruby nodded as if that made perfect sense, hugging the doll closer because the night before her mother had trusted it with something important. Ruby held the doll calmly because she still trusted her mother. Jada knew this trip wasn't only a service check. 3 days earlier, Monroe Capital Group had finalized the process to acquire a 51% controlling stake in Meridian Airways. Before her first board meeting in New York, she wanted to see that airline when there was no welcome team, no warning email, and no employees told ahead of time to smile at the new chairwoman. Jada didn't fully trust reports prepared for powerful people. She trusted the way employees treated a woman dressed plainly when they believed no one important was watching. At 6:25, mother and daughter lined up to board Meridian Flight 2 foreign from Atlanta to New York. Ruby held her mother's hand with her left hand and hugged the doll with her right. Jada pulled a small carry-on behind her. No assistant, no bodyguard, no luxury car waiting beyond the glass. Just a black mother, a 6-year-old girl, and 2 first-class tickets issued under their real names. The first-class cabin had 24 cream leather seats, warm yellow lighting, and the smell of fresh coffee. The passengers inside wore tailored jackets, expensive watches, and polished shoes without a scratch. A few of them looked at Jada, then at the carry-on, the khakis, the old sneakers, and Ruby's doll. The looks lasted only 1 second, but Jada knew 1 second could carry a whole verdict. Their seats were 3A and 3B. Just as Jada passed the second row, Diana Marsh stepped out from the galley and blocked the aisle. She was 47, hair pulled into a tight bun, deep red lipstick, her uniform pressed without a single crease. Her smile met the service standard, the mouth curved just enough, the eyes not warm at all. Marsh asked to see their boarding passes. Jada knew checking tickets was normal, but the way someone checked them said everything. She hadn't stopped the man who had just passed through. Only when Jada and Ruby came near the first-class seats did Marsh step out like a door locking from the inside. Jada pulled up the QR code on her phone. Marsh held the phone longer than necessary, looked at the screen, looked at Jada, then looked at the screen again. She said the system sometimes generated errors and needed additional verification. Her voice stayed soft, but there was no room inside that softness for the possibility that Jada really belonged here. Ruby looked up at her mother. Jada felt the small hand tighten right away. She didn't want Ruby to see her mother humiliated, but she also didn't want her daughter to see that her mother had to shout to be believed. So she kept her voice even, said the ticket was valid, and asked for her phone back. From seat 2A, Gerald Fitch lowered his newspaper. He was 55, with gray at his temples, a stiff collar, and a thick gold ring on his hand. He asked what was going on in the voice of a man who assumed every delay in the cabin was an insult to him. Marsh addressed him by last name and said she was checking. Fitch looked Jada up and down, his eyes moving over the sneakers, the small suitcase, and the old doll, then stopping on Ruby as if the child herself was evidence that mother and daughter didn't fit. He said first class wasn't for discount tickets and told Marsh to check carefully. A few passengers heard it. No one spoke. One person pretended to read an email. Someone else looked out the window even though the plane was still at the gate. That polite silence allowed the person causing the humiliation to believe the whole cabin agreed. Kevin Santos stood behind the galley counter, one hand on a tray of orange juice. He looked at Jada, then at Marsh, but in the end he looked down. Kevin had been moved into first class less than a year ago, and he knew Marsh could change schedules, write up his attitude, push him back onto late-night routes. Fear of losing his job locked his throat. Marsh still had Jada's phone. She said the airline's responsibility was to protect the comfort and rights of all first-class passengers. Jada heard the word all, but understood it didn't include her. She repeated the words, all passengers, very softly, not to mock her, only to make Marsh hear her own choice of language. Marsh asked mother and daughter to step aside while she verified. That turned Jada and Ruby into a problem being displayed in front of the cabin. Jada looked at seats 3A and 3B, less than 6 feet away. The electronic name tags on the armrests showed the Monroe name correctly. Marsh didn't look at them. Jada asked if she had scanned the code. Marsh said the device was syncing. Jada suggested checking the passenger list. Marsh said the process would take time. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own, but together they built a wall. The goal was no longer verifying the ticket. It was forcing Jada to prove she deserved the seat she had already bought. Ruby stayed quiet, looking from one face to another, then down at her doll. Jada placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and reminded her that Mommy was right there. The anger in Jada rose hot and clear. She remembered boardrooms where men asked her assistant who she was instead of asking her directly. She remembered her childhood in East Atlanta when her mother wore a janitor's uniform, and hotel guests pointed her toward the service elevator. Because Ruby was watching, Jada didn't let anger control her voice. She asked Marsh to call a supervisor or reservations. Marsh looked around the cabin and chose to escalate instead of admitting she might be wrong, lifting her radio and requesting security assistance for a possible invalid boarding document. Fitch gave a quiet snort. He said people printed very convincing fake tickets these days, soft enough that only the closest rows could hear, but loud enough that Jada and Ruby couldn't ignore it. Ruby turned her face toward him. Fitch immediately raised the newspaper, using the financial section to cover his face as if the sentence hadn't belonged to him. Jada felt Ruby's hand grow colder. She bent down to her daughter's eye level and said everything was okay. She didn't promise that adults would be kind. She only promised that Mommy wouldn't let her be scared. Ruby nodded. The absolute trust in her daughter's eyes hurt Jada more than every insult. 2 security officers appeared at the aircraft door in under 2 minutes. They wore dark blue uniforms and airport badges on their chests. Marsh walked toward them first, speaking in a low voice that still wasn't low enough to hide that there may be 2 passengers using unauthenticated documents and refusing to leave the first-class area. One officer asked for identification. Jada handed over her driver's license. The name matched the QR code, but Marsh still insisted the system hadn't confirmed their seating authorization. She began citing flight safety, the authority of the lead flight attendant, and the possible removal of non-compliant passengers. Jada stood straight. She didn't resist, didn't raise her voice, didn't give anyone the chance to turn her calm into aggression. She knew exactly how much a black woman in a space like this had to control even her breathing to avoid being labeled a threat. But she also knew she wasn't walking off this plane just to make Marsh's prejudice look legal. When one security officer reached out, by reflex, to guide her toward the door, Ruby tugged lightly on her mother's shirt. The girl looked at the doll, then at Jada. In her eyes was the question they had prepared the night before. Jada placed a hand on her shoulder and told her to take out what Mommy had given her. Ruby held the doll against her chest, turned its back toward herself, and pulled the tiny zipper. The thin metal sound was unusually clear in the silent cabin. From the secret cloth pocket, the girl took out a slim gray envelope, folded neatly enough to fit behind the doll's back. Ruby handed it to her mother with both hands. Jada opened the envelope. Inside were a black Monroe Capital Group card and the confirmation of controlling ownership in Meridian Airways, complete with electronic signatures, a verification code, and legal seal. She didn't hold it up like a performance. She simply handed it to the nearest security officer. The man read the first page. His eyes stopped on the line. Monroe Capital Group, owner of 51% controlling stake in Meridian Airways, effective 72 hours ago. He read it again, then looked at the card at Jada and at Marsh. The other officer leaned in to check the verification code. The air in the cabin changed before anyone said a word. Fitch lowered his newspaper. This time he didn't pretend to read. A woman in row 4 removed her glasses. A couple near the window turned their heads at the same time. 8 passengers seated in first class all looked toward the front. The silence no longer stood with Marsh. It turned back and pressed against her. Marsh took the black card with a hand that had lost its steadiness. She looked at the name Jada Monroe and the title Executive Chairwoman, then at the confirmation document. 4 seconds passed without a word. Every sentence about discount tickets, fake documents, and first-class rights hung in the cabin like something dirty no one wanted to touch. Kevin stood behind the galley, his face pale. He recognized the Monroe name from the internal email about the acquisition. He felt relieved that Jada had proof no one could deny, but also ashamed. If she hadn't been the new chairwoman, he would stayed silent and let mother and daughter be escorted off. Ruby zipped the doll back up and held it to her chest. She didn't smile in victory. She only looked at her mother, waiting to see what came next. To Ruby, the black card didn't make her mother stronger. Her mother had been strong before the flight attendant knew her name. Marsh finally placed the documents on the service tray. She didn't apologize. Instead, she said she needed to verify authenticity with headquarters. Her voice still tried to hold on to professionalism, but each word had slowed down. That was where she took shelter. If she couldn't deny the truth, she would stretch the process long enough to avoid admitting she was wrong. Jada looked straight at her. She told her to verify it. In the meantime, she and her daughter would sit in their assigned seats. Without waiting for permission, Jada took back her phone, held Ruby's hand, and walked past Marsh. She placed the carry-on in the overhead bin, helped Ruby into seat 3B, fastened her seatbelt, then sat down in seat 3A by the window. No one stopped them. Marsh stood in the aisle, pulling out her phone to find the headquarters number. Fitch lifted his newspaper but couldn't read. Kevin continued arranging glasses, his movements stiffer than usual. Jada looked out the window, one hand resting on Ruby's doll. The plane hadn't left the airport yet, but the power inside the cabin had already changed seats. Marsh still didn't understand that the call she was about to make wasn't only to verify a card. It would verify every word she had just said, every look she had just used, and it could end the career she had been leaning on for 20 years. In seat 3A, Jada Monroe looked out the airplane window while the Atlanta runway still sat under the early morning light. Beside her, Ruby had started to drift off, the cloth doll lying face down on her chest, one small hand still holding the back where the zipper was, as if she was afraid the mission wasn't really over yet. Diana Marsh's voice on the phone at the front of the cabin sounded small and tight, partly swallowed by the air conditioning, the overhead bins closing, and passengers pretending to be busy with their phones. Jada didn't look at Marsh for long. She had met that kind of person many times. People who didn't need to say directly that she didn't belong here because they had a whole clean system of words to say it for them. Additional verification, passenger comfort, flight safety, and responsibility to first-class travelers. Every word sounded like procedure. But Jada knew what sat beneath that layer of procedure was a question so old it had become boring. What right did a black woman in a plain shirt have to sit here? That question had followed her from East Atlanta, long before Monroe Capital Group had glass offices, before business magazines knew how to spell her name, before men in boardrooms stood up to shake her hand, instead of asking if she was there to drop off documents. 20 years earlier, Jada was 18, living with her mother in a 2-bedroom apartment near Moreland Avenue. Her mother cleaned rooms at a hotel near downtown Atlanta, a morning shift that started before sunrise. The woman's hands were always dry from floor cleaning chemicals, but when she touched her daughter's shirt before a scholarship interview, they were gentle, as if she were holding the most fragile thing in the house. Jada's father wasn't there for those mornings. He had disappeared when she was little, leaving behind a few blurry photos, a name on a birth certificate, and a blank space her mother never used for complaints. In their home, they didn't talk much about the absence of a man. They talked about the electric bill, the bus, grades, and which pair of shoes could last one more semester. On the day of her first scholarship interview, Jada wore the only white shirt she had with a collar still in one piece. Her mother had hand-washed it the night before, hung it near the window, then ironed it with an old iron whose cord had to be wrapped in electrical tape. The shirt still wasn't perfect. The cuffs were a little worn and one button didn't match, but it was the best they had. Jada looked at herself in the small bathroom mirror, shoulders straight, the way she had learned before anyone had taught her. The interview room was inside an office building with floors so polished that Jada felt nervous stepping too hard. She sat in front of 3 adults, her folder resting on her knees, years of transcripts arranged neatly inside. They praised her grades, but not for long. A blonde woman looked at the name of Jada's high school and asked what school she went to in a doubtful voice, even though the school's name was right there on the paper. That question wasn't asking for information. It was asking how a girl from that place could be sitting here, Jada answered calmly. She said the name of the school, talked about the advanced program, volunteering at the library, and about the essay she had written on business ownership in forgotten neighborhoods. But in their eyes, she saw a caution that had been there before she walked in. They weren't listening to find a reason to choose her. They were listening for the flaw that could explain why a girl like her had grades like that. The first time she was rejected. The letter came 3 weeks later, thin as a mass-produced apology. Her mother read it and didn't cry. She placed it on the kitchen table and asked if Jada wanted something to eat. Jada remembered the yellow light on the table, the smell of beans simmering in a small pot, and the feeling of wanting to rip the letter apart but folding it carefully instead. The rejection didn't make her feel smaller. It only taught her that some people had to be forced to look closer. She applied again, rewrote the essay, sent more recommendation letters, called the scholarship office twice a week, politely enough that no one could call her annoying without feeling ashamed. At the second interview, she wore the same shirt, this time with the mismatched buttons sewn in more neatly by her mother. When they asked what school she went to, she answered, then added that the real question should be what she had learned there. She talked about how poor people understood cash flow better than many people trained in finance, because they had to manage every dollar before they were ever allowed to make mistakes. She got accepted, not because they had suddenly become kinder. Jada believed that she got accepted because she made rejecting her harder to explain than giving her a chance. From that day on, she understood something that would become the backbone of her life. Sometimes competence isn't enough. People also make you present your competence in a way that doesn't force them to admit they misjudged you before you even began. 10 years before Meridian Flight 21, Jada walked into a conference room in Midtown wearing the cheapest suit she could buy with the remaining limit on her credit card. Back then, Monroe Capital wasn't an empire. It was a small investment firm with a few bold deals, a month-to-month office lease, and a young black woman many partners still assumed was an assistant even when she stood at the head of the table. The black suit was a little wide in the shoulders. The heels hurt after 10 minutes. She did her makeup in the building's shared restroom because she didn't have time to go to a salon. In her bag was the proposal to acquire a logistics business drowning in debt but sitting on transportation routes more valuable than its own leadership understood. The man sitting across from her that day was the owner of the company, older than her, richer than her, and confident in the way people are when they have never been mistaken for someone who doesn't belong in the room. When Jada sat down, he didn't look at her. He turned to his assistant and asked who she was. The air in the room froze. The assistant looked awkwardly at Jada. The lawyers lowered their eyes to the papers. The question wasn't whispered. It was intentionally loud enough to place her below the level of someone worth addressing directly. Jada didn't wait for anyone to introduce her. She opened her folder, placed the proposal on the table, and said she was the person who was about to buy his company. That answer made him look directly at her for the first time. There wasn't immediate respect in that look, but there was a crack. Jada had learned how to live inside cracks like that, widening them with numbers, with calm, with the kind of discipline built from days when no one allowed her to make mistakes. That deal closed after 7 weeks. The man never apologized for his first question, but when he signed the final document, his hand shook slightly. Jada didn't smile. She took the signature, stood, thanked the legal team, and left the room. Outside the elevator, she took off the high heels that had made her feet bleed and walked barefoot down to the parking lot because there was no one left who needed to see her be strong. Things like that don't disappear when the bank account grows. They only change shape. When Jada became the head of Monroe Capital, suspicion wrapped itself in praise. People called her impressive in a way that implied she was an exception. They called her strong while ignoring how many times she had been forced to be hard. They called her an inspiring story when they didn't want to name the injustice that had created that story in the first place. That was why, when Monroe Capital grew large enough to take over Meridian Airways, Jada didn't want to only read reports about customer experience. Reports always knew how to behave for a new owner. Survey charts always had pretty language. Executives are always prepared with the right answers. But a first-class cabin at 6:40 in the morning didn't rehearse for a black woman wearing khakis and traveling with a small child. Her assistant, Alana Reed, had pushed back gently when Jada decided to fly anonymously. Alana said the airline had just been notified about the acquisition, and it would be safer to let them prepare a proper welcome process, especially with Ruby traveling too. Jada wasn't angry. She knew Alana was thinking like someone protecting the schedule and managing risk, but Jada needed something no communications team could give her. She said she wanted to know how they treated a black passenger dressed plainly. That was the most important business data she needed before signing the first round of changes. Not data in a spreadsheet, but data in the lead flight attendant's eyes, in the silence of the passengers, in the reaction of the junior crew member who saw something wrong but was afraid to speak. An airline didn't only move people, it moved their dignity through a narrow space where every stair could become a wall. It wasn't the first time Jada had gone undercover. Since Monroe Capital was still small, she had personally visited hotels, stores, security services, and restaurants the company was considering investing in. She dressed plainly, asked normal questions, and waited to see whether people heard her as a customer or as a problem. That habit wasn't role play. It began in childhood poverty when she learned that the truest version of service appeared when employees believed the person in front of them couldn't retaliate. The night before the flight, in Ruby's bedroom, Jada prepared the doll. Ruby sat in the middle of the bed, her hair in 2 braids, serious as if she were taking part in a major ceremony. The cloth doll had been a gift Jada bought at a community fair when Ruby was 3. An older seamstress had added a secret zipper to the back so Ruby could hide small stones, little drawings, and sometimes candy she wasn't supposed to have before dinner. Jada placed the ownership confirmation, the black card, and a copy of her legal ID into a thin envelope. She folded it carefully and tucked it into the doll's back. Ruby asked why important papers had to go there. Jada zipped the doll shut, smoothed the yellow dress, and said it was because Ruby's doll was the safest thing in the world. No one ever looked inside. Ruby thought about that for a few seconds, then nodded. To a child, the answer was strange and logical at the same time. She hugged the doll tighter, as if from that moment on, it was no longer just a toy but the keeper of her mother's secret. Jada looked at her daughter and felt a quick pain move through her. She didn't want Ruby to grow up learning too early that sometimes papers had to be hidden inside a doll so adults would believe her mother. But she also wanted her daughter to know that calm wasn't weakness. Calm could be the way you kept control until the truth stepped out. Now on the plane, Ruby had used exactly what her mother had trusted her with. The girl rested her head against the armrest, her eyes half closed, one hand still holding the doll. Jada gently smoothed a few loose strands of hair that had fallen from Ruby's braids. Marsh was still at the front, phone pressed to her ear, back stiff and straight. The first-class passengers had returned to their pretend activities, but the air hadn't gone back to what it was. Everyone knew something had cracked. Jada's phone buzzed in her palm. A message from Alana appeared. The Meridian CEO is calling your official line. Do you want to answer? Jada looked at Thomas Crane's name above the missed call notification. That CEO must have already been told by legal that the new controlling owner was sitting on one of the airline's own flights after the lead flight attendant called security on her before takeoff. Jada could answer right away and let official power pour into the cabin like thunder, but Ruby was asleep. The plane hadn't left the gate, and Jada still hadn't seen everything she needed to see. She typed back, "Not yet." Then she placed the phone face down. Power doesn't always need to shout the second it has been insulted. Sometimes it sits still and watches for a few more minutes, letting the people who think they control the situation explain exactly who they are. Marsh ended the call after almost 6 minutes. When she turned back, the original pink tone had left her face. Her mouth still held the professional curve, but the skin around her eyes was tight. She walked down the narrow aisle to row 3 and leaned down just enough so the whole cabin could hear clearly, but not enough to be called humble. She said the legal department was verifying the documents. In the meantime, to ensure flight safety, Jada looked up before the sentence could finish. Her voice was low and clear. She told Marsh she should think very carefully about what she was about to say next. Behind Marsh, Kevin stood by the beverage counter, understanding for the first time that his silence had become part of this test too. Marsh looked at her. For the first time since Jada had stepped onto the plane, she hesitated. Not because she had suddenly understood she was wrong, but because she was beginning to realize the woman in seat 3A didn't need permission to have the right to sit there. Meridian Flight 21 pushed back from the gate 7 minutes behind schedule. The first-class cabin didn't complain out loud, but their eyes slid toward row 3 as if Jada Monroe and Ruby had delayed their morning. The engines trembled beneath the floor, the seatbelt sign lit up. Diana Marsh walked through the aisle with a stiff kind of professionalism. Jada sat by the window, one hand resting lightly on Ruby's thin blanket. The girl had woken up when the plane rolled toward the runway, but she didn't ask anything else about what had happened earlier. Ruby held the cloth doll with both hands, looking outside as Atlanta moved slowly past the small window. To a 6-year-old, takeoff was still magic. To Jada, it felt like a closed room lifting into the sky with all the things people tried to hide behind politeness. As the plane accelerated, Ruby leaned into her mother. Jada placed a hand on her shoulder very lightly. She was afraid of takeoff. She was afraid of what Ruby would learn if no one in this cabin was held responsible for the way they had looked at her and her mother. Jada had once been the child standing beside her mother in a hotel lobby, watching guests pass by as if a janitor's uniform made the woman who gave birth to her part of the floor. The plane lifted off the runway. The pressure pushed Jada back into her seat. Ruby gave a tiny laugh at the feeling of her stomach dropping. That laugh softened Jada for one moment, but as soon as the aircraft steadied above the low clouds, she saw Marsh unbuckle at the front and begin preparing the first service round. Marsh did everything according to procedure. She checked the hot towels, coffee cups, orange juice, drink cart, and preference list. Her voice in seat 1A was warm and practiced. With seat 2A, Gerald Fitch, she leaned in a little more politely and asked if he wanted his usual black coffee. Fitch answered with a nod, barely looking up, enjoying the familiarity of a man who had been served often enough to believe it was the natural order of things. Then the drink cart passed row 3. It didn't stop. It didn't turn back. There wasn't a single question for Jada or Ruby. Marsh continued to row 4 with the same standard smile, as if seats 3A and 3B were only a technical gap on the seating chart. The action was small enough that anyone who wanted to deny it could call it an oversight. But Jada watched long enough to know it wasn't an oversight. It was a message delivered through withdrawn service. Marsh might have to let her sit there, but she still hadn't accepted that Jada belonged in this cabin. Ruby noticed more slowly. The girl watched the drink tray move away, then looked at her mother. Jada said nothing. She took the small bottle of water from the seat back pocket in front of her, opened it, and handed it to her daughter. Her hand didn't shake. She had learned a long time ago that some humiliations were designed to make the person being insulted react first, so the reaction itself could be used as evidence against them. Kevin Santos, standing behind the divider, had seen everything. He saw Marsh stop at row 2, skip row 3, then soften her voice at row 4. His face tightened. In his hands were a pitcher of water and several glass cups. He glanced toward Marsh, then toward Jada. In first class, the distance from the galley to seat 3A was only a few steps. But for Kevin, those few steps were as long as his entire employment contract. He came out at last. No cart. No announcement. Just 2 glasses of water and a small napkin in his hands as he stepped toward row 3, while Marsh was leaning down farther back. He placed the water in front of Jada and Ruby. The movement was quick, almost secretive. Jada looked at him and said, "Thank you." Kevin didn't answer. He turned away immediately, his face red from shame or fear of being caught, and returned behind the divider like someone who had just slipped evidence to his own conscience. Jada didn't drink right away. She looked at the droplets of water on the outside of the glass. Ruby held her cup with both hands and took a small sip. In that silence, Jada understood that Kevin wasn't a bad person. But people who aren't bad can still do wrong by standing too far away from the truth. She didn't hate him. She only recorded it. The test wasn't over. Gerald Fitch left seat 2A about half an hour after the plane reached cruising altitude. He folded his newspaper and stood to walk toward the forward lavatory. The narrow aisle forced him to pass close to row 3. When he reached Jada's seat, he slowed for a beat, short enough that other people might not be sure, long enough for her to know it was intentional. He tilted his head, not looking directly at Ruby, then said quietly that she should hire a good lawyer because forging airline documents was a federal crime. The sentence landed between them like a piece of cold metal. Jada looked straight ahead. She didn't answer. She didn't turn her head. She didn't give Fitch the pleasure of seeing that he had touched something. He wanted to turn her silence into anxiety, turn her calm into proof that she was hiding something. But Jada had met men like Fitch in boardrooms, building corridors, negotiation tables, and places where she had once been mistaken for staff. They wanted her to react so they could call her the problem. Ruby heard it. Jada knew her daughter had heard it because the small hand on the doll tightened. She placed her hand gently over Ruby's, without speaking. One touch was enough to say her daughter didn't have to understand all this cruelty right now. She only needed to know Mommy was still there. After that, Ruby took a small notebook from her backpack. The cover was purple, its edges bent from being carried to too many places. She opened to a blank page and used a blue crayon to draw an airplane with windows bigger than its body. Inside were a mother with black hair, a little girl, and a doll in a yellow dress. Jada looked over and saw Ruby carefully writing underneath in uneven letters, "Ruby Airplane." Jada didn't smile. She was afraid that if she smiled, tears would come right after. Instead, she placed her hand over her daughter's for 1 second. Ruby didn't know what shares were or understand ownership structure or board control. But in her mind, this plane had become a place where her mother couldn't be pushed out. Jada's phone buzzed as the plane moved through brighter clouds. She opened her email on the in-flight Wi-Fi. The message came from Marcus Webb, Monroe Capital's legal director. Marcus rarely used extra words. The email was only a few lines. Meridian's legal department has confirmed the documents. Meridian CEO Thomas Crane is on his way to JFK to meet you. He wants to know whether you would like us to make an official announcement during the flight. Jada stared at the email for a long time. Marsh could be forced to apologize in front of the whole cabin. Fitch could choke on his own silence. Kevin could breathe again. Ruby could see that her mother was recognized immediately, but Jada didn't want to end the test too early. Not because she enjoyed watching people destroy themselves, but an official confirmation would make everyone correct their behavior too quickly. She didn't need to know how they acted once they were ordered to respect her. She needed to know how they acted in the suspended space where the truth had touched their hands, but the ego was still looking for an exit. She typed back, "Not yet, wait for me." After sending it, Jada placed the phone face down on the small table. Ruby kept drawing more clouds. The light outside the window turned bright white. In the cabin, Marsh continued serving like someone determined to prove she hadn't been shaken. But the more perfect she became, the more she isolated herself. Every coffee cup she placed down made the deliberate skipping of row 3 clearer. Kevin received the internal email 12 minutes later. His service tablet buzzed while he was checking special meals. An urgent alert from Meridian Crew Operations appeared on the screen. Passenger in seat 3A, Jada Monroe, is confirmed as a representative of the new controlling owner of Meridian Airways. All related interactions must be logged. Cabin crew must maintain the highest service standards and await executive guidance at JFK. Kevin read it once. Then again, his throat went dry. He looked over the divider toward Jada, who sat quietly by the window, not acting like she owned anything except her own calm. He looked at Ruby's drawing. Then he looked at Marsh, who was preparing the drink cart for the next round, her movements harder than they needed to be. Kevin could walk over and quietly tell Marsh. He could remind her that the email had confirmed it. He could suggest serving row 3 immediately. but in his mind came the last 6 months, the times Marsh corrected him in front of passengers, the comments that he wasn't refined enough for first class, and the good routes she saved for people she liked. He needed this job. His mother was being treated for diabetes. Next month's rent had gone up. People often think silence is only cowardice. Sometimes it is built from bills. If you were Kevin, knowing the truth was in your hands while Marsh was about to keep mistreating Jada, would you speak up or stay silent to protect your job? If you've ever stayed quiet because you were afraid, are you sure you would be brave enough when the cost was your paycheck, your schedule, or your family's insurance? This question isn't easy because morality rarely arrives alone. It usually walks in with rent, a sick mother, and the fear that someone with power can turn your life into hell. Kevin stood behind the divider, his finger hovering over the screen. In the end, he saved the internal email to his official system log, not to his personal phone. He hadn't spoken yet, he still wasn't brave enough. But for the first time, he had done something to keep the truth from disappearing. Marsh returned to the galley. She saw Kevin looking at the tablet and asked if there was a problem. Kevin turned the screen off a little too quickly. Marsh narrowed her eyes. He said it was just a meal update. She didn't fully believe him, but she didn't have time to dig. Marsh had received partial confirmation from the ground, but she was still clinging to the phrase legal is verifying. To her, it was the last piece of wood in the current. Time moved slowly on the flight. Jada read a report on her tablet, but every so often her eyes left the words to observe the cabin. Fitch didn't say anything else, but each time he turned a page of his newspaper, the paper sounded stiffer. A female passenger in row 4 finally smiled at Ruby, but it was too late for that smile to call itself courage. Kevin passed row 3, looking like he wanted to say something, then turned away again. Ruby slept for another 20 minutes, her head resting against her mother's shoulder. When she woke, she asked if her airplane was going to reach New York soon. Jada said they were almost there. Ruby looked at the doll and whispered that the doll had done a good job. Jada smoothed her daughter's hair. Inside her, anger had settled into cold resolve. What happened that morning wouldn't end with a personal apology in the first-class cabin. It would go into training files, board reports, and the first question she would ask when she took control of Meridian: who gets believed before being forced to prove they deserve it? Near the end of the flight, Marsh prepared the drink round before landing. This time, she pushed the cart more slowly. Kevin stood behind her, watching each row. He knew the internal email had arrived. He knew Marsh knew enough to stop. But she still moved toward row 3 with the posture of someone trying to reclaim the story through one final statement. The drink cart stopped in front of Jada's seat, not at service distance, at interrogation distance. Marsh didn't ask what Jada wanted to drink. She placed her hand on the cart and leaned down just enough that her voice wouldn't carry too far, but enough that Ruby could hear if the girl wasn't looking out the window. She said she had worked for this airline for 20 years, knew the procedure better than anyone, and stood by her decision. Jada looked up. She looked at the woman in front of her, the woman who had used procedure as a shield for her own prejudice, and said she knew. 1 second of silence opened between them, small but sharp. Then Jada continued very quietly, saying that was exactly the problem. Marsh froze. Kevin, behind the divider, didn't look down anymore. Fitch lowered his newspaper just in time to hear the end. The plane began its descent, trembling slightly inside the white clouds. The test wasn't over. It was only preparing to land with all the evidence. Marsh still thought she could call a procedure. When the wheels of Meridian Flight 24 touched down on the runway at JFK, the entire first-class cabin gave one short jolt. Ruby Monroe woke up suddenly in seat 3B, her eyes still heavy with sleep, her arms still wrapped around the cloth doll against her chest. Jada placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder and said nothing. Outside the window, New York appeared in strips of sunlit concrete, everything so normal it almost felt cruel. Inside the cabin, nothing was normal. The first-class passengers had spent the whole flight in a careful silence. Some pretended to read the newspaper. Some pretended to answer an email. Some looked out at the clouds as if the sky could erase the fact that they had watched a black mother and her 6-year-old child get stopped right in front of their seats. Gerald Fitch in 2A was still holding his newspaper, but his hands had lost their earlier ease. The paper trembled slightly every time the aircraft shook on the taxiway. Diana Marsh stood at the front of the cabin, one hand on the galley latch, the other holding her tablet. After descent, she had returned to the posture of a lead flight attendant, but the professional layer no longer held together. The corner of her mouth had stayed tight too long, her eyes avoided row 3, and her hand kept smoothing the edge of her uniform more than necessary. After that final statement before landing, she hadn't served Jada and Ruby anything else. Procedure once again had been used to avoid acknowledging line the person. The plane left the runway and taxied toward the gate. Normally, this was when first class came alive with seatbelts unclicking, phones reconnecting, and people standing too early even before the light went off. But that day, impatience was being held back. A piece of information had already passed through the crew tablets, through Marsh's phone, and through Kevin Santos's face behind the divider. That news hadn't been announced to the passengers, but it had changed the gravity inside the cabin. Jada didn't look around to measure the effect. She had seen enough. She opened a bottle of water for Ruby, wiped a streak of crayon from her daughter's finger, and gently straightened the yellow dress on the doll. Ruby looked at her mother as if asking whether the mission was over. Jada only smiled. Not yet. Some flights only end when the plane stops. Some tests only end when people are forced to name exactly what just happened. The seatbelt sign turned off. But before the passengers could stand, the cockpit door opened. The entire first-class cabin stopped. The captain stepped out, holding his hat in his hand, his shoulder stripes still neat, his face more serious than a normal end-of-flight greeting. On commercial flights, captains rarely appear before passengers deplan, especially not to stand in the middle of first class with their eyes directed at one specific seat. His presence was the first layer of truth, something living and physical that Marsh couldn't call a misunderstanding. He stopped in the aisle, a few steps from row 3. His voice was deep, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. He addressed Jada as Ms. Monroe, then apologized for what had happened on today's flight. On behalf of the crew, he said they had failed to provide the standard of service she and her daughter deserved. The apology wasn't perfect. It still carried corporate language. But what mattered was that it was spoken publicly, by the person with operational authority over the flight, in front of the people who had sat silent while Jada was blocked in the aisle. Fitch lowered his newspaper. This time, he didn't pick it back up. Ruby looked at the captain, then at her mother. In the little girl's world, the person who flew the plane was very important. Seeing that person stand in front of the cabin and apologize to her mother made Ruby's face both curious and serious. Jada placed a hand over her daughter's hand, not letting the moment turn into a stage. She accepted the apology with a small nod, not rushing to forgive on behalf of things that had not yet been fully recorded. Marsh stood near the front, her lips pressed into a thin line. The captain didn't look at her for long, but one glance was enough to show he had read the notice from the ground. Kevin Santos stood behind the divider, shoulders tight. He heard that apology and felt his face heat up. Throughout the flight, he had known something was wrong before any official message came through. He had given water to Jada and Ruby, but water didn't erase the silence when Marsh called security. The plane came to a full stop at the gate. The jet bridge pressed against the aircraft. A metallic mechanical sound rang from outside. The main door didn't open right away. A ground employee gave the signal. Marsh had to step forward to open the door, but her hand moved slightly slower when she turned the latch. There was no longer the confidence of someone controlling the cabin. Each second stretched as if even the door itself knew something else was waiting behind it. The door opened. Thomas Crane, the 60-year-old CEO of Meridian Airways, stood just outside the jet bridge with 2 assistants and a woman in a black suit wearing an internal investigation badge. Crane didn't wait for passengers to leave. He stepped into the cabin, gave the captain a slight nod, then looked straight towards seat 3A. He nodded to Jada, not so deep that it became performance, not so light that it avoided responsibility. The second layer of truth, and was on voice from the cabin on Marsh's outside control. The air changed clearly. Passengers who wanted to stand suddenly stayed seated. Fitch looked out the window, but the window couldn't save him now. Marsh stood beside the door, caught between the airline CEO on one side and the passenger she had just tried to turn into a suspect on the other. Crane looked at her. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene. Just the face of someone who knew a serious problem was no longer contained inside an internal report. He asked for the internal investigation team to begin immediately. The woman in the black suit stepped forward and opened her tablet. An assistant behind her recorded the time. Everything happened cleanly, coldly, precisely. The same kind of precision Marsh often used to hide contempt, only this time it turned back toward her. Kevin stepped out from behind the divider before anyone called his name. He didn't step forward loudly. He didn't make himself a hero. He only stood at the edge of the aisle, holding the service tablet, and said he could testify about what had happened. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silent cabin it carried far enough. Marsh snapped her head toward him. Her eyes held both warning and betrayal, as if Kevin was the one who had broken something. Not as if she had done it the moment she blocked Jada at row 3. Kevin swallowed, but he didn't step back. He said he had witnessed Jada presenting a valid boarding code, witnessed Marsh holding the phone unusually long, heard the comment from the passenger in 2A, saw security being called before the passenger list was fully verified, and saw the first service round skip row 3A and 3B after Ms. Monroe had already taken her seat. No one in the cabin breathed loudly. Jada looked at Kevin. She didn't smile at him. She didn't give him an easy release. But she didn't interrupt him either. Kevin was telling the truth late, and late truth still had value as long as it didn't ask to be called courage too quickly. The internal investigator asked Kevin to preserve all logs on the tablet, including the urgent email from crew operations. Kevin nodded and placed the device on the service tray. He had saved the system record earlier, and now that small act became the bridge that kept his silence from swallowing the evidence. Marsh saw it. Her face changed for one very short second. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of Jada. She was afraid of the file. The third layer of truth wasn't in a single sentence. It was in the scale. Marsh's phone started vibrating again and again. One message, then three. Then the screen lit up with a string of alerts. Crew operations, union representative, schedule department, a coworker asking whether the rumor was true, and an unknown number that might have been her private lawyer. The incident had left the airplane's cabin. It had entered the system that Marsh had trusted herself to control with 20 years of experience. Marsh looked at the screen, then at Crane, then at Jada. She didn't look at Ruby. And the fact that she didn't look at the child said more than any defense. Ruby was still sitting in seat 3B, holding her doll, her small feet not touching the floor. She had been made to stand in front of the whole cabin as part of the problem, looking like strange baggage attached to a mother who didn't belong. But in the moment an apology was needed, Marsh still saw only the risk to her career. She said the only thing a person who had clung to procedure could say when procedure no longer shielded her enough. At the time of the decision, she hadn't seen any authenticated communication. She had followed the procedure. That sentence didn't fall into the cabin like an apology. It felt like the lid of a box closing. Marsh was trying to stuff the whole story into one narrow slot at the time of the decision. But Jada knew the real decision had happened before the documents appeared. It happened when Marsh looked at the light blue shirt, the old sneakers, the cloth doll, and Jada's skin color, then chose suspicion before she chose service. The documents had only exposed what was already there. Crane mentioned a formal internal investigation. He said all statements, service logs, security data, crew records, and relevant passenger accounts would be collected. Marsh listened and still kept her back straight. She said she had done her job. If the procedure needed to change, that was a management issue, not her fault. Not one word was for Ruby. Not one word was for calling security in front of a 6-year-old child. Not one word admitted that the way she had said all first-class passengers had tried to push the mother and daughter out of the word all. Jada unbuckled her seatbelt. She didn't stand immediately. She bent down to help Ruby put her sketchbook into the backpack and adjusted the doll strap in her daughter's hand. Only then did she look at Crane. She didn't need to say much. People with real power don't always have to raise their voices. She requested a full report on this incident before Monday's board meeting. Not a polished summary, a full report. The security call, passenger statements, tablet logs, internal emails, and every service decision made after she and Ruby had taken their seats. Crane nodded. Jada continued, saying she needed a review of Meridian's entire passenger identification and service training process, not just in first class. Not just with lead flight attendants. From boarding gates to economy cabins, from verification language to the authority to call security, from the way employees understood flight safety to the way they separated real risk from bias wearing a cleaner name. The internal investigator typed quickly. Kevin stood beside the galley, eyes lowered. Fitch stared straight out the window, his entire body stiff. Marsh still didn't apologize. But her silence now was no longer powerful. It was her final line of defense. Jada turned to Ruby. She placed a hand on her daughter's cheek and said she had done very well. Ruby hugged the doll tighter, her face lighting up in the way children do when they know they kept a promise. She didn't fully understand controlling shares, investigation authority, or a board meeting. But she understood that her mother had trusted her with something important, and she had kept it until her mother needed it. The passengers were asked to remain seated for a few extra minutes while the internal team collected information. Some people looked annoyed, but no one dared complain loudly. Minutes earlier, they had been spectators to humiliation. Now they were part of the scene. That made them smaller. The captain left the cabin after confirming with Crane. He looked at Jada one more time, not trying to drag out the apology. Kevin signed an initial confirmation with the investigator. Marsh was asked to hand over the service tablet and keep her personal phone available so legal could contact her through the union. She objected softly on that point, then stopped when Crane looked her way. 20 years of experience didn't disappear, but it was no longer enough to close the story. Finally, passengers were allowed to leave the plane row by row. Fitch stood in row 2A. He folded the newspaper very slowly, slid it into his leather bag, and adjusted his cuff. For a few seconds, he looked like a man trying to remember how to behave politely after politeness could no longer hide cowardice. He stepped into the aisle and passed row 3. Then he stopped. Jada looked straight ahead. She didn't give him the gift of her eyes. Ruby looked up. Fitch opened his mouth. No sound came out. Maybe he intended to apologize. Maybe he meant to explain. Maybe he wanted to say he hadn't known. But not knowing couldn't erase what he had said about the fake ticket, the lawyer, and the federal crime. And in front of a woman who wouldn't even look at him, he suddenly couldn't find a way to make any sentence sound less cowardly. He closed his mouth and continued out into the jet bridge. Ruby watched his back, then looked at her mother. She asked what he had been going to say. Jada finally turned to her daughter and gently stroked the doll's wrist. She said she didn't know, but he hadn't said it. That answer stayed in the cabin as Fitch disappeared through the door. Some people only speak boldly when they believe the person in front of them can't answer back. When the truth stands beside the person they once looked down on, they don't have words brave enough to come out of their throats. After the last passenger left the first-class cabin, Meridian Flight 24 looked like a crime scene without blood. Coffee cups still sat on trays, Gerald Fitch's newspaper had been left behind in the seatback pocket of 2A, and the hot towels had gone cold in the silver basket. Jada Monroe stood in the aisle, one hand holding Ruby's, the other holding the cloth doll, watching the people wearing internal investigation badges step in to measure the place where the humiliation had just happened. Diana Marsh was asked to stay behind. She wasn't handcuffed, wasn't dragged away, and there was no loud punishment scene, easy enough to turn the cabin into a stage. She was simply asked to sit in row 1, hand over the service tablet, give an initial statement, and confirm that she would be removed from international routes during the review. For someone who lived through control, being handled in the same administrative language she had once used against others was its own kind of loss of power. Kevin Santos stood beside the galley with both hands clenched. He had handed over the internal email log, confirmed that the first service round had skipped 3A and 3B, and recorded the exact time Marsh called security before verification had been completed. The investigator didn't call him a hero. They wrote him down as a cooperating witness. Kevin lowered his head. That was accurate. He had cooperated, but not from the beginning. That truth followed him out of the cabin with the sound of the air conditioning still running overhead. Gerald Fitch wasn't detained for criminal handling. He hadn't hit anyone, hadn't made a direct threat, hadn't broken a law clearly enough for airport security to put it into a formal charge. But his name appeared in the incident report, next to the description of the comment about fake tickets. For a man used to existing in first-class spaces as if everything served him, that was the first ink mark on a file he had once believed people like him would never have. At the Meridian office inside JFK, Thomas Crane invited Jada into a conference room overlooking the jet bridge. Ruby sat on a sofa outside the glass-walled room with Alana Reed, Jada's assistant, eating cookies and pretending to give her doll a drink of water. The little girl was tired, but she still held the doll close to her chest like a teammate who had just completed a mission. Crane was 60 gray-haired in a clean gray suit with the expression of a man who knew an official apology couldn't erase a public experience. He placed the preliminary statement in front of Jada, then apologized. Not the kind of apology meant for the media, not an if you felt offended sentence. He acknowledged that the airline had failed in the way it verified, served, and protected the dignity of a passenger and her young child. Jada listened to the end. She didn't cut him off, and she didn't use silence to make Crane collapse. When he stopped, she only said she hadn't come here to receive an apology. She had come to find out how this airline operated when there were no prepared cameras, no welcome team, and no VIP list marked in red. Now she knew. Crane looked at her for a moment. The question he asked didn't dodge the issue, but it wasn't neutral either. Would this affect the acquisition decision? Jada looked through the glass, where another Meridian plane was being pushed back from the gate. She said not yet. But it would affect what she did first once the deal was complete. She didn't speak with anger. Anger had already done its work inside the airplane cabin. In that room, Jada used the voice of someone who had turned an insult into a plan. She requested incident data, crew training records, boarding pass verification procedures, discrimination complaint statistics from the last 5 years, and a specific list of the authority a lead flight attendant had when calling security. Crane wrote down each item. At one point, he started to explain something about safety. Jada looked at him. He stopped explaining. That night, at a hotel in Manhattan, Ruby lay on the large bed in pajamas printed with stars. The city outside the window glowed like a giant electric board. Jada sat beside her with a small sewing kit in her lap, the cloth doll lying between them. The secret zipper on the doll's back had been opened and closed too many times, and inside there was no longer a black card or ownership papers. Everything had been returned to Jada's document case. Ruby watched her mother stitch the edge of the fabric. She asked if the doll had finished its mission now. Jada nodded. Ruby thought about that, then asked if that meant it was just a doll now. The question made Jada stop the needle for a few seconds. She looked at her daughter's small face, at the seriousness in the eyes that had seen too much in one morning. Jada told her it had always just been her doll. Ruby seemed satisfied with that answer. She took the doll back, laid it on its side on the pillow, and pulled the blanket up to its neck as if tucking in another child. Jada turned off the bedside lamp, but stayed there a little longer in the glow from the window. The doll wasn't a weapon. It was a 6-year-old's toy, something that should only held drawings and candy hidden from Mom. The fact that Jada had to place evidence inside it said more about the adult world than it ever said about Ruby. 3 weeks later, in the first board meeting after Monroe Capital completed the acquisition, Jada introduced a mandatory training program for all Meridian flight crew, not just lead flight attendants, not just first class. Every employee who interacts with passengers, gate agents, special assistance teams, contracted security, cabin crew, and route managers. The program didn't teach employees how to recognize billionaires. It taught them how to recognize bias inside their own reflexes. Jada refused to name the program after herself. A communications executive suggested Monroe Standard, which sounded polished and easy to put into a press release. Jada crossed it out immediately. The final name was Ruby Protocol. Not to turn her daughter into a brand, but to remind every employee that on every flight there might be a child watching how adults treat their mother. The rule was simple. Passengers shouldn't have to prove their dignity before they're served. Respect can't be withheld like a reward. Ruby Protocol changed Meridian's training from the root. Every simulation began with the question, are we checking a ticket or are we judging a person through bias? Employees were trained to separate real safety risks from the discomfort of privileged passengers. The security call procedure was rewritten to require cross-verification before turning a passenger into a suspect in front of a crowd. Every discrimination-related incident was sent directly to the Service Ethics Board. Diana Marsh was under investigation for 2 months. Her file clearly recorded violations of service standards, flawed risk assessment, failure to serve a passenger after verification information had arrived, and failure to show responsibility toward a minor involved in the incident. She was removed from lead flight attendant duties on international routes for an extended period and required to go through a reassessment process if she wanted to return to premium cabins. In the end, she still said she had followed procedure. But procedure no longer gave her a place to hide. Kevin Santos was officially recorded as a cooperating witness and was invited to join the training feedback team. For the first time in his life, he stood in front of a room of new employees and spoke not about courage, but about the cost of being late to courage. He said he had seen something wrong, had been afraid, and had served water instead of speaking the truth immediately. Silence can protect your job today, but it can let someone else lose their dignity right in front of you. 6 months later, Jada and Ruby boarded another Meridian flight out of Atlanta. This time, Jada wore the white suit Ruby had asked about at the airport. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, nude heels were on her feet, a black leather bag was at her side, and her priority status was clearly visible in the system. She wasn't flying anonymously. She didn't need to for this flight. Ruby still held the cloth doll. The secret zipper had been stitched closed so neatly it was almost invisible. Inside, there was no black card, no document, no mission, only soft stuffing and a few old pieces of fabric. When the mother and daughter reached the aircraft door, a new flight attendant smiled and greeted Ms. Monroe and the little girl. Her voice was warm, not overdone, not trembling in fear of the title. Ruby looked at her mother, then at the doll. She didn't need to open the zipper anymore. Jada stepped into the cabin. The leather seats were still pale. The smell of coffee still came from the front. But this time, no one blocked the aisle to ask what right she had to sit down. Jada didn't feel that dignity had been given to her that day. She only felt that something that had always belonged to her was finally not being snatched away at the door. Maybe what makes this story stay with us isn't the black card, and it isn't the reversal of power. What stays is the image of Ruby holding that cloth doll, standing beside her mother in the moment of adults' confused appearance with human worth. A 6-year-old child had to pull out proof so people would look at her mother correctly. And that is enough to make us ask ourselves, why do some people have to prove so much before they're treated with basic kindness? Power that shows itself is easy to recognize. It wears suits and polished shoes. It has assistants walking behind it, has names on welcome boards, private lounges, and seats already reserved. But hidden power reveals other people more clearly. When Jada wore a plain shirt and walked with her little daughter, she wasn't any less powerful. She simply entered the cabin in the shape that prejudice is most willing to attack, and the people there showed her who they were. We often mistake uniforms, clothes, skin color, accents, luggage, and old shoes for dignity. But dignity doesn't live in a first-class seat, doesn't live in a black card, and doesn't live in confirmation from headquarters. Jada had the right to sit in seat 3A before she ever stepped onto that plane. Her ticket was valid, her name was valid, her presence was valid. The wrong thing wasn't that she failed to prove herself fast enough. The wrong thing was that they doubted her too fast. Diana Marsh didn't fail because she failed to recognize a billionaire. She failed because she failed to recognize a passenger. Gerald Fitch shouldn't be ashamed because he insulted the airline's new owner. He should be ashamed because he thought he had the right to make a mother and child feel small just because they didn't match the image he believed belonged in first class. If Jada hadn't been rich, if Ruby hadn't kept the documents inside her doll, would they have been believed? That is the most painful part. This story isn't a reminder to treat people well because anyone might secretly be powerful. It should be a reminder that no one deserves to be treated like a human being, no matter what their social status is. A tired mother, a man in a worker's shirt, an elderly person moving slowly, a child holding a doll, a passenger who doesn't speak fluent English. All of them deserve to be verified through procedure without being humiliated. Decent service isn't a privilege reserved only for people with money and status. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before anyone listened to you? Maybe it happened in a store, an office, an airport, a school, or even inside your own family. If there was a moment when you had to swallow your anger, stand a little straighter, speak a little softer, and prove more than you should have just to be treated like a normal person, tell that story. Not to relive the pain, but to call what happened by its true name. And if you have ever been Kevin, if you have ever seen something wrong and stayed silent because you were afraid, this story is for you too. Courage doesn't always arrive in the first minute, but when the truth can still be saved, step forward. Sometimes one witness statement can't erase the wound, but it can stop the world from calling that wound a misunderstanding. In the end, Jada didn't need anyone to confirm that she was worthy. Ruby didn't need the doll to become safe anymore. But because of that morning, some flights after it would be different. And maybe that is the greatest meaning of power when it is used correctly. Not to make the whole cabin bow to one person, but to make sure tomorrow an ordinary person can step onto a plane without having to hide their dignity inside the back of a cloth doll.